A veteran of NBC, Fox, and now at CNN. He makes his beat debut right here, special for the new book, Countdown 1960, about the Kennedy-Nixon election and its echoes. Chris Wallace, like many, I've been watching you. I'm thrilled you made the time. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. I don't have to die now. I've gotten my eulogy right here and now.
Sure. Well,
it's kind of depressing to see yourself aging in about 2 minutes of pictures. But thank you for having me. I very much appreciate it, Ari.
Yes, sir. Well, I'm glad to have you. We whipped through from NBC days, which goes back to your link to this very broadcast network here, what you did at Fox, being in the thick of it. I want to jump right into that, and we're going to definitely get to the book because I know people are interested in that. But just take a look at something you were right in the center of, and then ultimately, of course, left Fox. I want to look back to that 2020 election period. Take a look.
American votes in a presidential election are actually counted in a foreign country. These are serious allegations.
Their machines caused thousands of votes in one Michigan county to be switched from Donald Trump to Joe Biden.
This is an extremely flammable situation, and the president just threw a match into it. He hasn't won these states. Do you still question whether or not Joe Biden won the election fair and square?
Chris, I stand by my vote to object on January 6th.
Congressman, you say anything that distracts from that.
Major settlement in the lawsuit accusing Fox News of airing lies related to the 2020 election.
The settlement to be paid by Fox News, roughly $787.5 million.
How did you approach your role then? And was Fox wrong to air so much material that amounted to, at times, election misinformation?
Well, the way I handled my job then was the way I've handled it during a half century in the business. And, it's funny, Ari, because I get praised a lot. People will come up to me and say, I really appreciate how even-handed you are, how fair you are. And I started at the Boston Globe in 1969. And being fair, being even-handed, it wasn't an object of praise. It's what kept you from getting fired. It was like being accurate, spelling somebody's name right, getting the address right. And the fact that it is, to a certain degree, that I have gotten praise or stood out for doing that, to me, is kind of depressing. I think it's a bad commentary about our business and how it has changed over the years.
I understand that. I have someone who worked at Fox not praising you. And we only learned about this from private text messages. And as a longtime reporter, you know how this works. I'll read you what was said, and you get a chance to respond. Laura Ingraham says, my anger at the news channel is pronounced. Her making a distinction, apparently, between what some news anchors do and what she does. Tucker Carlson texted, it should be. We devote our lives to building an audience, and they let Chris Wallace wreck it. Your response?
Well, I'm employed, and Tucker really isn't anymore, so that's part of my response. Look, I had a very good 18-year run at Fox, and they never messed with me the whole time. As you can see from some of those reports, I asked tough questions. I booked the toughest guests, and I never got second-guessed by the executive floor at Fox. I sensed a change in Fox as time went on, particularly after the 2020 election, particularly after we correctly, but we're the first to call Arizona on election night in 2020, and the Trump campaign was very upset with us, and a lot of Trump supporters were very upset with us, and they began going to other news outlets like Newsmax that were even further to the right. And I sensed a change in Fox at that point, and that there was less interest, even in the news side, in sticking to the facts, sticking to the truth, and telling that audience to try to win them back what they wanted to hear. And they paid a big price for it. You talked about the misinformation about the elections. And, I have to say I'm not unhappy that Fox had to pay $787 million, because there ought to be a price to pay when you don't tell the truth and you deliberately misinform people about things that the evidence in that case showed that higher-ups at Fox knew wasn't true.
You thought the hefty penalty was a good thing for trying to correct some of their mistakes?
Look, there's a price to pay. You know, there are laws about libel and defamation, and clearly Fox settled because they thought they were going to lose the case and have to pay even more.
Fascinating. You have interviewed 7 presidents. There's no automatic Sunday show dispensation. You have to earn every one of those interviews through your work, efforts, reputation. And so I want to look at one that I think you remember was made a splash at the time. Bill Clinton, who served as president, going back and forth with you about national security and bin Laden, important, heavy stuff. For those who don't remember, let's take a look at that.
Why didn't you do more to put bin Laden and al-Qaeda out of business when you were president?
I'm being asked this on the Fox network. You did Fox's bidding on this show. You did your nice little conservative hit job on me. What I want to know is...
I'm asking a question. You don't think that's a legitimate question?
No, it was a perfectly legitimate question, but I want to know how many people in the Bush administration you asked this question of.
Did you ever watch Fox News Sunday, sir?
I don't believe you asked them that.
We asked plenty of questions.
Educate us about how you approach that, how it feels in the moment. He was alleging that you were somehow biased and that you were raising things in a political manner or feeding the audience so it would repeat back a political view of things. You had a back and forth. But since I have you here, first time ever interviewing you, and you've done that with more than one president, tell us about it.
Well, it was a pretty memorable interview. If you go on YouTube, last time I checked, which was a number of years ago, there were 10 million views. You know, to put it in context, there had just been a docudrama on ABC called The Path to 9/11, and they had been very critical of Bill Clinton. And in fact, there'd also been a Pulitzer Prize-winning book by Lawrence Reich called The Looming Tower that were critical of Clinton and said that he hadn't done enough to put bin Laden and al-Qaeda out of business when he was president. So I simply asked him a question. You know, that's what we do for a living. I later asked Terry McAuliffe, I said, have you ever seen him sort of fly off like that? And he said, have I ever seen him fly off? We call that the purple rage in the White House.
Did you feel anything in the moment? Did you feel something that then you had to screen to be professional? Or you've done this so much, it was just one more day?
Well, no, I mean, it wasn't just another interview when you're getting called out, even though he was the former, not the current president of the United States. But look, you could put up clips of me with Donald Trump in 2020
sure.
when I talked to him about the cognitive test. And I said, you know, you talk about the fact that you aced it. I mean, it wasn't so hard, Mr. President. They have a picture of an animal and you have to identify it as an elephant. I mean, that's what we do for a living. And, you know, we're there to seek the truth, to seek heat, rather light, not heat.
Yeah.
And, you know, not to make friends. And not to take, and Ari, not to take sides, to be equally tough, whether it's conservative Republican or a liberal Democrat.
Meanwhile, former President Donald Trump and his allies continue to lie about the federal response to Hurricane Milton and Helene. In a post on social media yesterday, Trump called the response to Helene, quote, the worst in U.S. history. In a Wall Street Journal op-ed published yesterday, Trump's running mate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, continued to run with the lies started by the former president last week, writing, quote, under Ms. Harris and Mr. Biden, FEMA has funneled millions of dollars to non-governmental organizations whose stated goal is facilitating mass migration into the U.S. None of that is true, although it is something Trump did as president right in the middle of hurricane season back in 2019. And while campaigning on Trump's behalf in Arizona yesterday, the second highest ranking Republican in the House, Majority Leader Steve Scalise, also pushed that lie. Take a look at that and the response from Vice President Kamala Harris yesterday to the misinformation being spread by Trump.
FEMA, among a whole bunch of other federal agencies, has been using your tax dollars that are supposed to help you as American citizens if you get some kind of disaster, and every community gets them. They use that money helping illegals here that they brought into America, you know, to get hotel rooms that they're destroying, free cell phones, food, shelter, all of those things. And then when an American needs help from their federal government, they say, oh, we're spread too thin and we're out of money.
It's profound, and it is the height of irresponsibility and, frankly, callousness.
Yeah.
So lives are literally at stake right now. And the idea that somebody would be playing political games for the sake of himself, but this is so consistent about Donald Trump. He puts himself before the needs of others. I fear that he really lacks empathy on a very basic level to care about the suffering of other people and then understand the role of a leader is not to beat people down, it's to lift people up.
Absolutely.
Especially in a time of crisis.
So, Jonathan Lemire, the big lie moves around, whether it's wreaking havoc on our constitutional republic with the lie about the election or the lies about January 6th, to lies that actually impact people's day-to-day lives and their safety, whether it's about Haitians, legal migrants in Springfield, making their lives miserable, and people in the town, the city of Springfield, now to people in disaster zones who are being fed misinformation and they don't understand and know what is true and what is not true. This, again, is what this election is about, what the choice is about.
Yeah, these are lies from Donald Trump and his allies that put people's lives in danger. These are extraordinarily dangerous. We are still seeing in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, people who are not trustful of the federal response, of officials who were there, FEMA representatives encountering some tense situations when they find people in particularly like Western North Carolina who are still obviously suffering and isolated after what happened there. And now we have local officials really concerned about the impact here in Florida. We heard from President Biden yesterday kind of go out of his way to strike a bipartisan tone and say, look, I spoke to Governor DeSantis. We're offering our help.
The governors will also, they will say, yes, we spoke to the president.
Yes, I mean,
we're getting what we need.
Right. Governor DeSantis did not take a call from the vice president, but he did take it from President Biden. He has said that has happened. Other governors, including Republican in Georgia, said, yes, we spoke to the White House. They have been helpful. But it's local officials right now who are deeply concerned. We just interviewed the mayor of Fort Myers, Florida, in the storm's path on Way Too Early a few minutes ago, and he acknowledged misinformation, disinformation, a real issue. And he urged residents to turn to trusted sources, including the local government's website, to say, look, this is what you need to hear. You need to get out, listen to us. Everything Trump's saying is just clouding the picture and making it more dangerous.
Yeah, you wonder too about the editorial standards of the Wall Street Journal op-ed page, which we respect and read all the time and talk about on the show, just publishing uncritically what J.D. Vance is saying about the management of this hurricane. But we've been saying it now for, since Helene hit, and Donald Trump has been saying these things. What a disgusting moment to go right to lies and to go right to division when people need unity, they need help. That, by the way, as John points out, they're getting. The Republican governors of Tennessee and Georgia, and Ron DeSantis is saying as well that FEMA's doing a good job, that they're here, they're on the ground. We talked to Governor Cooper yesterday of North Carolina, who said the same thing. It's a very difficult moment. There's destruction everywhere you look, but we are getting the help. But Donald Trump cannot help himself, and J.D. Vance is the number 2 guy. He's the beta in the relationship. He has to echo the lie, of course.
Absolutely.
But my gosh, what an appalling time to do that.
First of all, our hearts and prayers go out to the folks who are in the eye of the storms. But it seems to me it's not only bereft; it's a reflection of a kind of moral depravity, right? So that you translate people's sorrows into grievance.
These people's lives are on the line,
right? And you're translating people's tragedy into grievance and hatred. It shows you the nature of the political calculus that's informing these folks. It's just morally depraved in my view.
Yeah, no, and also it impacts overall. I mean, this is not, I don't think, a leap, Richard Haass, when you look at what's happening in this country and you have the system breaking down from top to bottom because the former president keeps trying to poke holes in what is our constitutional republic and our systems of responding to people and federal aid getting to people. Doesn't that impact the way that NATO allies and others around the world are looking at us and watching this election ever so closely?
Yeah, so many reactions. There's nothing sacred anymore.
Nothing. That's it. Nothing matters.
There's no norms. There are simply no norms, or there are norms. There's just no acceptance of them or of observation of them. Yeah, I've just come from Germany this week, and the rest of the world doesn't get a vote, but boy, are they worried. They are affected, obviously, by what happened here fundamentally. And it's not just foreign policy, and that's what it connects with what you said, Mika. You know, the impact of the United States in the world is not just what the State Department does or the military does. It's who we are. Right. It's the example we set. And when people see things like this, again, it gets to the core. They don't recognize this United States, and they worry if we're this divided about the most obvious human crisis, how are we going to ever be there for them?
But, and as I've said before, in the middle of the Clinton administration, when things were as heated as we thought they could ever be, Republicans and Democrats worked together. Right? First year, we had 3 hurricanes come ashore in Northwest Florida. Bill Clinton was there. I told everybody when they first I said, no, you want the President of the United States there. You want him there. You want everything that comes with the President of the United States there. And that's what every governor, Governor Tennessee, Willie, Governor Lee, a very conservative Republican. Governor McMaster in South Carolina, very conservative governor. Of course, Governor Kemp in Georgia, overwhelmingly popular governor. And you have Senator Thom Tillis in North Carolina. All of these officials have been saying that the White House and the administration is doing a great job. And they're very grateful. Ron DeSantis saying he's gotten everything he's asked for. And this is, you know, no standards. You know, one of the things I always tell people when they spread conspiracy theories is go to the Wall Street Journal. I said it's a Murdoch paper. Go to the Wall Street Journal. I don't tell them always go to the Wall Street Journal editorial page, but as you point out, the Wall Street Journal is publishing disinformation that might as well be in Epoch Times. And the fact that it's from a vice presidential candidate matters not. This is the same guy who lied about cats and dogs being eaten while the governor of his own state said stop. This is when you say there are no standards. This is a perfect example of it, Willie. There's lies every day. There's people that right here in the Wall Street Journal that I've respected for decades who are trying to pretend this is just any other election. There are people that I've known my entire life that they're engaging in this anti-Trumpism. Where, oh, yeah, well, sure. And I've said this before. Sure, you know, yeah. So Donald Trump is lying about eating cats and dogs, and Donald Trump's lying about hurricanes, and Donald Trump tried to overthrow the 2020 election results. But did you see Kamala Harris's third answer on The View? No, but we laugh. They're dead serious. And we've seen this for 4 years. We've seen, you know, a very respected U.S. senator who went on to work at a university, told friends, he said, yeah, January 6th, okay, whatever. But did you see what Biden did with student debt relief? I don't want the Democrats to ever complain about the riots on January. See, again, this flattening out that we talk about, and here when people are in such misery and suffering, you have the Wall Street Journal editorial page running disinformation, running lies that the Republican governor of Georgia, the Republican governor of South Carolina, the Republican governor of Tennessee, the Republican governor of Virginia, Republican senator of North Carolina, there's a Democratic senator of North Carolina to also say it, all of the local leaders, all of the state officials, Republican and Democratic alike, are saying this administration is doing everything that we have asked of it. And yet, disinformation spreads, even in sources that used to be above that.
And again, at a time of great suffering, which is to Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and the people who follow him, the politicians who follow him, this is a political game. This is a moment to create some division, to get support. It is, and you know, on a lesser scale, the Springfield, Ohio was the same. People were suffering because of the lies they were telling, and they just didn't care because they thought there was some political benefit to that. And you're right, Joe. I mean, there are people who will say of January 6th, but student loan debt, or pick your issue, and they look the other way. And they listen to what Donald Trump says over the people who are actually on the ground in this case, the mayors, the governors, saying, no, it's a terrible scene, but we're getting the help we need from FEMA and the Biden administration. But if you talk to people we know and friends of ours, they'll go, did you hear They're actually using the money that they should have been using to rebuild Americans' homes to give cell phones to illegal immigrants. Yeah. We're going to hear about this. Right. From people we know. Right. Why aren't you guys covering it and all that? So the Donald Trump lie blocks out the truth among Republicans, among MAGA Republicans.
The corrosive effect has been shocking. Right. I've been shocked by all the people who have been swept up in it and who are cynically playing along for whatever the reasons. I mean, there's a reason why Dick Cheney, why Liz Cheney, why Ken Edelman, why over 100 Republicans that have worked for the Reagan administration, Bush 41, Bush 43, the Trump administration, have come out and said they're voting for Kamala Harris. There are still people, though, unfortunately,
country over party,
that are putting not only party but also their personal financial interests over what's best for America.
No, we did much better in 2020. We won. We did win. It was a rigged election. We did a phenomenal job with the pandemic. In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there. They stole the FEMA money just like they stole it from a bank so they could give it to their illegal immigrants that they want to have vote for them this season.
None of those things are true, but you already know that. The reason we showed it to you is because no matter the issue, there's one thing that Donald Trump will always do as part of his wannabe autocrat playbook, and it is rely upon the reactions and emotions that are stirred up by those kinds of lies and disinformation. The ex-president relies on this constant stream of falsehoods to create anxiety and sow chaos and undermine the institutions necessary for a democracy to function, and then to cast himself as somehow above the chaos as the only person who can fix them. It's the kind of leadership that threatens the very office Trump is running to serve in again. And Tom Nichols is out with a stark new warning in the November Atlantic cover story about how a second Trump term could end the American presidency as we know it. Nichols writes this, quote, Donald Trump and his authoritarian political movement represent an existential threat to every ideal that George Washington cherished and encouraged in his new nation. Today, America stands at such a moment. A vengeful and emotionally unstable former president desires to return to office as an autocrat. Trump has left no doubt about his intentions. He practically shouts them every chance he gets. His deepest motives are to salve his ego, punish his enemies, and place himself above the law. Should he regain the Oval Office, he may well bring with him the experience and the means to complete the authoritarian project that he began in his first term. Joining our conversation, staff writer for The Atlantic, Tom Nichols, whose new piece we just read from. Also joining us, Washington bureau chief and White House correspondent for The Grio, April Ryan's back. And with me at the table, I think for the very first time, co-founder and executive director of Protect Democracy, Ian Basson's here. Tom, take us through your extraordinary new piece.
Well, we looked at Washington not simply to measure how far we've come or fallen, because every president comes up short. I mean, that's part of being George Washington, is that every president falls short of the standards that Washington managed to set in those 8 years that he was president. The bigger problem is that Washington created a set of expectations and standards and norms and traditions that really protected this nation, that really protected the institutions of government, gave us the ability to survive as a democracy under terrible conditions. And Trump is threatening them all, including ideas such as stepping down from power, handing back institutions and offices that don't belong to you. You know, Washington felt this very strongly, very keenly, that the army was not his army. They were his fellow citizens, and he was fighting alongside them. That the presidency did not belong to him. That it was a sacred trust that was given him by his fellow citizens. Even his commission as a general, he did something really unheard of for the 18th century. He went to Congress and he took the piece of paper that had his original commission as a general and he handed it back. He said, the war's over. I'm glad to have served my country. I ask for your indulgence, he said, that I may be allowed to return to private life. Trump believes in none of this. Washington was a stoic, a man of principle, a man of integrity, and knew that the country needed to be able to survive without him. And Washington left us these institutions. Trump treats all of them like they're his property, and that they're his to use against his enemies as soon as he can scrabble his way back into the Oval Office.
Let me read this on that specifically. Quote, during his term as president, Trump expected the military to be loyal, but only to him. He did not understand or care that members of the military swear an oath to the Constitution and that they are servants of the nation, not of one man in one office. Trump viewed the military like a small child, surveying a shelf of toy soldiers, referring to, quote, my generals, and ordering up parades for his own enjoyment and to emphasize his personal control. There's, of course, the darker side of that as well, that he didn't want all of them. They weren't all his generals, only the ones who didn't die and were not injured serving the country. Just talk about the dark pathology with which he views the American military, Tom.
He thinks of the American military as a group of men and women who owe their service directly to him. And if they disagree with him, they don't belong in the military. He has even gone so far as to suggest that people like Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, when he was president, should be executed for actions they took while in uniform, when in fact what Milley did with the direction and in cooperation with the Secretary of Defense was to call China and reassure them that before and after January 6th that the United States was a stable partner and that we were not in the throes of some giant civil upheaval. Trump hates that notion. He is intimidated by people of principle. And the United States military, I'm happy to say, after working at the Naval War College for 25 years, the United States military is full of people of principle, full of patriots who understand their duty to the Constitution. But those principles baffle Trump. They enrage him. And this is why when he stood in Arlington Cemetery and looked around at all these graves, he turned to Kelly and his chief of staff and said, I don't get it. What was in it for them?
Why is this not disqualifying Ian Bassin? Why are we looking at an election that is in the margin of error in every poll?
Well, first off, it's absolutely disqualifying. When you talk about that sense of loyalty, so I was a lawyer in not just the White House for the president, I've been a lawyer at other levels of government for elected officials. And lawyers have duties of loyalty to their clients. And when you're a government lawyer, among government lawyers, there's a really interesting intellectual discussion that lawyers often have, which is, given that we don't have the kind of client that a lawyer has out in the private sector, who is our duty of loyalty to? And there's a couple of candidates when you're serving in government. Your duty of loyalty could be to the public in the jurisdiction in which you serve. Your duty of loyalty could be to the Constitution or the city charter if you're working in New York City Hall. Your duty of loyalty could be the branch of government. So I might be a lawyer in the executive branch, and I might have some loyalty to represent the interests of the executive or the interests of the office of the presidency as opposed to the interests of, say, Congress in a battle between the branches. And there's a lot of discussion among government lawyers about how do you order those priorities of your loyalty to the office, your loyalty to the document, your loyalty to the public. But do you know who is not part of that ever in those conversations? Your loyalty to the individual person who occupies that office. Never was there any discussion among government lawyers that we owed any loyalty to Barack Obama, the person. And not only did we know that, but President Obama full well knew that, and he would have been horrified if we ever even considered that we would have had loyalty to Barack Obama, the person. And what's so disqualifying and so amazing here is, in Donald Trump's mind, the people who serve him have no loyalty to the public, they have no loyalty to the office, and they have no loyalty to the Constitution. The only expectation of loyalty, and they're testing for this now and who will staff his administration, is loyalty to Mr. Donald Trump, the person.
Well, you explained it as disqualifying, and I served in government and view it as disqualifying. But I think if you ask the Harris campaign, you ask the Trump campaign, they view this race as, again, a margin of error race. How do you make that mean something to voters with 27 days to go?
Well, look, I think, and Tom's piece in The Atlantic is fantastic. I just read it. It's excellent. And as he talks about in that piece, there was something that Washington fundamentally understood, which is that the most precious thing that existed in the early days of the country, and I would argue the most precious thing that still exists today, is that power, choice, the ability to determine one's future is not the property of the president. It's not even the property of the government. It's our property. It belongs to every American citizen. Americans own the choice about their own future. And what I think people need to fundamentally understand is that Donald Trump is threatening to take that choice away from us. And here's the thing. If he is successful, if he's returned to power and you're somebody who supports him and you like what he has done, then you should hold on to the choice 4 years from now to decide whether you want to keep going down that road with a potential successor of his, or I think he would probably argue himself for another term, or whether you want to change your decision. That's your choice. But here's the thing. If you put him in power and you don't like what he's doing, what do you do then if you've given away the choice about whether to keep him or not? That choice is precious and we should hold it.
Matt Gorman is a former aide to Mitt Romney, who also served as communications director for the National Republican Congressional Committee. Michael Hardaway is former communications director for House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries. And I'm going to get to Republicans and Kamala Harris in a minute. We have breaking news, Matt. We just got new fundraising numbers. Kamala Harris has been running for president since the day, essentially, that Joe Biden stepped down and almost immediately said he was backing her. So 80 days. She has crossed the $1 billion mark. She has raised $1 billion in 80 days. My very complicated question for you, Matt, is what?
Yeah, I think what I'll say is this. Joe Biden was essentially acting like a proverbial dam on Democrat money and enthusiasm at the end there. And what you saw, I think, in those first, especially 60 days when Kamala became the nominee, was just a flood of the stuff that was being held back. Now, the great paradox in a lot of this stuff is when it comes to presidential politics, money matters less than, say, if you were a House candidate. If the spending disparity were the same in, say, a House race, it'd be a big deal. But really,
but you'd rather be Kamala Harris's bank account than Donald Trump's right now.
Just like all of us, we'd rather have more money than less, of course. But when it comes to actually what it can do and move the needle, there are fewer ways. It's funny enough when you get to the presidential level because it relies so much more on earned media than it does on, say, paid media. Right? What one killer ad that you're going to put against Donald Trump that's suddenly going to change the race after he spent 10 years in the spotlight? A lot harder to do.
Yeah, I mean, he is right about that, of course, Michael. Earned media is something Donald Trump has done extraordinarily well since the day he came down that golden escalator. But what can you do with $1 billion? And so help us get it into some perspective. What does it mean given this very different landscape that we're in right now?
The biggest value of all that money is she should give it away. And she's already done this to some degree in writing a check to the DCCC, writing a check to the DNC and the DSCC, but she should write larger checks. Because if she wins or if she loses, we need to have a majority in the House. We need to have a majority in the Senate. And there are local groups that are doing that work. And so the answer to your question is, in less than a month, she can't spend that money, obviously, but she should give it away to the groups that can help Democrats control the House and control the Senate. I think also the CBC is doing good work on the ground, and I think that's another opportunity for her to spread out some of that cash.
Okay, we're going to be watching. Go ahead, Matt. Go ahead.
That's a very good point by Michael, and you're going to see this on the Republican side too, right? You see Trump, he's doing a rally in Coachella, California, obviously not a swing state. He's going to do an event at Madison Square Garden, again, New York, not a swing state. The reason of those two states, again, same thought as Michael, they want to juice up Republican turnout in House races where California and New York are some of the most competitive House districts in the country. So again, they're looking at down ballot races to try and help them if either's elected president.
Okay, so, and I think there are actually 3 big venues, all not in battleground states, where he's going to be doing those kinds of events. But let me ask you about Mitt Romney, because you know him so well, Matt. Any surprise that he said, kind of do the math, but he wouldn't say I endorse Kamala Harris?
No, you know what? Like, look, I love Mitt Romney. I will never say a bad word about him. He was a great man, a great boss. I think he's playing it smart, right? I think if you go out and way out on a limb and you really make a big scene like Liz Cheney and others have done, look, it's their right. They can certainly do it. It's a lot harder to come back to the party afterwards, right? Because Trump could win or lose, but the party is moving in a more populist direction. So if you want to rebuild, want to be a voice, you want to stay in the tent proverbially.
And let me ask you, Michael, about something the Wall Street Journal wrote about, because they talked to actually an NBC pollster who said this. In combined NBC polls this year, Republicans led by 2 percentage points over Democrats, 42 to 40%, when voters were asked which party they identify with. That compares with Democratic leads of 6 points in 2020, 7 in 2016, 9 points in 2012. What do you make of that? And does it tell you anything about November?
We're all getting old. And I think as people get older, they vote more Republican. But listen, I think at a functional level, if you look at policy by policy, there are many Democratic policies that Americans support. I think, when you take a step back, people that are answering that question probably are looking at personality and the way they feel currently about perhaps the economy and other areas. But if you break out sort of Obamacare and a number of policies that Democrats have delivered, there is significant support on both sides, I think, for those policies.
My opponent, the former president, has been running since 2020. And
literally filed like the day after
right.
the
So we
election,
have a lot of time to make up for. But I'm traveling around the country. I'm spending a lot of time talking with folks, listening to folks. And the one thing I can report back from the field, if you will, is that people are exhausted by that old, tired playbook of Donald Trump's. They really are. Let's chart a new way forward. And what I'm seeing is that a lot of Americans, regardless of their party, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, they're ready for a new generation of leadership that is about solutions and common sense and finding common ground. And that is what I am offering.
Now,
Vice President Kamala Harris last night on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, showing why voters see her, according to that same poll Sarah and I were just talking about, as the change candidate. It is part of an all-out media blitz for the vice president this week as she crisscrosses the media landscape, leaving no voting group untouched. Harris appearing everywhere from the podcast Call Her Daddy, beloved by women under 35, to 60 Minutes, and The View, to legendary radio broadcaster Howard Stern, whose audience is massive and diverse and usually open to hearing things beyond just politics. They're also 75% white. She's ending the week at a Univision town hall tomorrow. Harris's appearances will reach approximately 27 million people of all walks of life as she reaches out to all Americans, regardless of party. Harris's big tent approach is part of the reason why so many prominent Republicans have now publicly endorsed the vice president and are eager to stump for her as well. Case in point, later today, former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney and former Trump aides Alyssa Farah Griffin, Cassidy Hutchinson, and Sarah Matthews are campaigning for Harris in the must-win Philadelphia suburbs. Joining our conversation is MSNBC political analyst Tim Miller, a former RNC spokesman, host of the Bulwark podcast. Sarah is here as well. Tim, just tell me how you see the race today.
Too close for comfort, Nicole. I don't know. I'd rather be Kamala than Trump, but it's a very close race, and it shouldn't be, for all the reasons that all your viewers know and that all of us on this panel know, given how Donald Trump has disqualified himself over and over again. But unfortunately, that's where we're at. And so it's going to be important to kind of squeeze out as many voters from all of these different elements of the Big Tent coalition as possible. I was listening to your previous segment, as Sarah pointed out. I think that reaching to these college-educated Republican voters are going to be critical, but so is the core base of the Democratic Party, younger voters, Black voters, Hispanic voters. I'm happy she's going on Univision tomorrow. So I think that's good. And the other observation I just will have, since I'm the boy on the panel, I feel like I can say this clearly. Those names, Cassidy, Alyssa, Sarah Matthews, Liz Cheney, good on all of them. But man, the men that were around Donald Trump have really let us down. And I'm very proud of Sarah and Cassidy, who I've gotten to know, and Alyssa, who I know well, and for their courage and bravery to be out there. But it shouldn't really just be Mark Meadows' assistant, that's out there. There should be people higher up the food chain, and unfortunately, the only ones that have had the courage to stand up around the close Trump inner circle seem to be the women that went in to work for them. So good on them.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't know if I want to get into the boy-girl sociological analysis about that. You, Sarah, might be better for that, or we could bring in a psychologist. I don't know. I think maybe it's possible that the guys around Donald Trump have too much pride and too much potential concern about their access. I think that there's a lot of, especially in Washington, there's a lot of ego. There's a lot of desire to be in the mix, to be in power. And, they have this kind of emptiness inside them, a lot of these people around Donald Trump, like Meadows and my old boss, Reince Priebus, and all these guys, and they want to get phone calls. And so they don't have the courage to speak out. And luckily, these younger women with their whole careers in front of them did. And Liz Cheney, though, is really more in their shoes. Liz Cheney gave up everything to do this, and good on her. And again, I think, and she would do it again if you asked her. So, and there are others, obviously Kinzinger and others that are out there. But I think just speaking particularly about the people that worked for Trump, a lot of people have let us down who went in there to work for Donald Trump.
I mean, you can extend the analysis, which I agree with, Sarah, to the books that they've written. Cassidy Hutchinson makes clear that if she kept her mouth shut, she had an opportunity to maybe go to Florida with Donald Trump and continue her ascent in MAGA world. She made different choices. She now has legitimate security concerns, and she became one of the most important witnesses in the January 6th congressional investigation. And history will determine the role that committee and that probe played in moving the Justice Department to pursue Donald Trump as the instigator of January 6th. But it's a stark contrast to the book H.R. McMaster wrote, who saw everything. He was in the Oval with Donald Trump and Lavrov, and his minions went out and made sure we all knew that Trump couldn't have leaked classified information because we didn't tell it to him. I mean, he knew in the room at the time that Donald Trump was a very dangerous threat to U.S. national security. What is it in the manosphere that also reflects this inability to see something and do something when it's not masculinity to act like Donald Trump does, to lie and to cheat and to refuse to concede contests that you lose?
Well, look, I'm not going to say it's about men or women and there's something different in their psychology. I will just say in particular with these men, the one that Tim is referring to, the people who are around Donald Trump, I think it's fair to call it cowardice. And one of the reasons that it irks me so much to see them maintain their silence, to sit on the fence after everything they've seen and what they know, is that every day with Republican voters against Trump, I listen to just regular people who voted for Trump in the past, talk about why they can't support him because of January 6th, because he didn't engage in the peaceful transfer of power, because he's not a good person, whatever their reasons. Real people who live in their communities are willing to put their faces on billboards and their voices in radio ads and be on TV ads. They know they're going to draw heat. Some of them have been swatted. Some of them have been attacked. Certainly, they're all getting negative emails. And the fact that people who have worn our country's uniform, who have been generals, who are supposed to be among our bravest people, can't seem to find the courage in this moment to defend the country from somebody that they know is manifestly unfit and who will do things that I know they view as catastrophic, whether that's abandoning Ukraine, whether it's pulling us out of NATO. They know how frightening Donald Trump is. They know he is a person who is bereft of character. And for them to not say something in this moment, and let me just say, guys, if you're sitting there saying, boy, I think this is unfair, prove me wrong. There's still time. We'd love to hear from you. Come say what you saw. You tell us after 9/11, you said if you saw something, say something. That's what we should be asking of these guys. We know they saw something. So say something now. Defend your country. Do the right thing. There's still time left. George W. Bush, there's still time left. Anybody, Mitt Romney, there's still, come in. The water's fine.